everyone knows the song. Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that was born to be king, over the sea to sky. Well, I've come to Skye in a hired car rather than by boat, and in search not of a lad who was born to be king, but, better yet, one who was born to be a commoner. One who was born in 1852 in, we think, this now deserted village of Unish, and who would move away in his teens as an economic migrant and work his way up from being a distillery labourer to becoming a distillery storekeeper, or, in the phrase written on his 1878 marriage documents, a spirit cellarman. Oh, and had he lived just 3 or 4 years longer, Neil Lamont, the spirit cellarman, might have witnessed the birth of his great-granddaughter Mary, my mother. Skye has a long, rich history, and indeed prehistory. You can still see the remains of ancient forts or brochs on the island. More than 1,000 years ago, the Vikings came, just as they did to Ireland, some to raid, but some to settle and make lives for themselves here. In fact, the Norse claimed sovereignty over the Hebrides in the 12th and 13th centuries. And you can still hear their legacy in some of the place names, such as where I'm staying, just up the road from Kolbost, in Hussabost. Anything ending in bost is an echo of the Norse era, the term meaning townland or farm. And after the Norse relinquished authority, the people of the Highlands and Islands organised themselves according to the clan system. Clan coming from the Gaelic for family. And that was the system which was in place, turbulent as it was, evolving as it was, for the next few centuries, right up until the time that the bonny boat winged its way over the sea to Skye. For centuries, the clan system meant that the land belonged to the clans through their heads, the clan chiefs or chieftains. But they, in turn, had obligations to look after their people, the ordinary families who farmed their own small strips of land and who paid rent, often in kind, to the chief. After all, they were all of the same clan. There's a wonderful Gaelic word, duchas, which encapsulates those sets of obligations, that sense of belonging to each other and to the land in the one clan together. But by the time the bonny boat set sail, that is, by the time of the last Jacobite uprising in 1745, everything had begun to change, and the pace of change would pick up over the next few decades, affecting everyone on the island, including the Lamonts, Lamont in the Scottish pronunciation, the spirit cellarman's family. Neil Lamont's grandfather, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, John Lamont, was born in the parish of Brackadale here in 1769. He married Flora Morrison, and they would have 4 children that we know of, Mary, Donald, Neil and another Flora. Donald Lamont, the spirit cellarman's father, was born in this parish in 1814. But by the time he married Mary McKinnon and they started their family in turn, they had moved away. They had moved some 20 miles out to the west coast to Lorgill. Quite why they had to leave this area, we can never be sure. But there could be a clue in the history books. Historian Roger Hutchinson tells us that Brackadale was cleared of its tenants in the 1820s, some going overseas, some being displaced internally, including some families who indeed made their way to Lorgill. This was the era of the so-called Highland clearances, a phenomenon that shapes the whole history of the Highlands and Islands throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. Landlords began to make space for large-scale sheep farms or for deer or grouse moors. The land was improved. Those scattered strips of the run-rig system were consolidated and more efficient modern farming techniques were introduced. To make room for all this, of course, the bulk of the tenants had to be moved elsewhere. Rents were raised. Families were sent to the coastlines to fish or burn kelp. Some went to Canada and Australia. Some families were moved more than once. These scattered mounds of boulders and sheep's bones are what remains of Lorgill. It, too, was cleared of its crofters later in the 19th century. From the late 18th and through the 19th century, the clearances, the eviction of tenants, was driven by several major forces at work. There were international forces, there were ideological forces, and there were indigenous forces. The international forces included wars, the American War of Independence, the Napoleonic Wars, and that had the effect of driving up the prices of certain goods, especially food to feed the troops, but also of kelp, which could be used in manufacturing and indeed in the manufacturing of weaponry and gunpowder. The other international factor was the growth of the British Empire at that time. You could go off to India and make yourself a fortune, then come back and buy yourself a townhouse in a fashionable part of London, and then to impress your fellow nabobs, you would buy up a stretch of Scottish Highland and convert it into a grouse shooting or deer shooting range, conveniently free of crofters. At the ideological level, this was also the era of the Industrial Revolution, and indeed not too far away from here in Edinburgh, Adam Smith was arguing that the invisible hand of the market would sort everything out for the best. And at the local indigenous level, other factors were at work. This was a period in which the population was increasing, but so were the debts of the lairds, many of whom thus felt driven to seek greater commercial returns on the land they owned. This shift to a commercial imperative saw to it that the clan laird became or was bought out by the landlord. And that sense of duchus, that sense of mutual belonging and mutual obligations, was replaced by a proprietorial relation of property owner to disposable property. The sense of familial bonds was replaced with what Angela Carter describes in one of her parables as the cold white meat of contract. Of course, we mustn't romanticise the lives of the crofters. Clearances aside, there were hardships enough to endure. This is what's left of what is called a black house. Black because of the colour of the walls because they burned their fires inside. And as you can see, well, it's got what's left of some thatch on the roof and dry stone walls. Now growing plenty of plant life. But you would have had the whole family living in this one little hut with maybe a door, maybe one or two windows if you were lucky. And I'd guess it's sunny now and it looks very cosy, but it must have had to be pretty tough to eke out a living off these hillsides. To make matters worse, the potato blight that was sweeping Europe, not least in Ireland of course, came to Scotland in 1846. So between clearances and rural poverty, there were waves of emigration, willing or unwilling, along with internal displacement. And it is in the wake of these shifts that Neil Lamont moves away, leaving his homeland and family behind. By the time of the 1871 census, Neil is 18, a distillery labourer and living with cousins in Glasgow. He and Mary MacLeod, also from Skye, marry in Glasgow and start a family. By the end of the 1880s, Neil has attained his job title of Spirit Cellarman on the documents, and he and Mary have had 3 children in Glasgow: Donald Lamont, Anne Mackenzie Lamont, and Alexander MacLeod Lamont. But by 1890, when their daughter Mary is born, there's that name again, they appear to have moved once more. Her birth is registered not in Glasgow or anywhere else in Scotland, but across the Irish Sea in Belfast. It's in Belfast then that Neil and Mary's son Alexander MacLeod Lamont grows up to marry and have a son of his own, Ian, my maternal grandfather, my mother's father. And what of those who remained in Scotland? Well, in the late 19th century, they would have at least witnessed, if not taken part in, a series of acts of resistance which finally brought about some change, limiting the power of the landlords and establishing certain rights of the crofters. Organised resistance in the 1880s took the form of rent strikes and even sometimes of some quite violent resistance. When the local sheriff, William Ivory, tried to serve notices of eviction on the crofters of the Braes area, they burned the papers and beat the sheriff's officer off the land, sending him packing back to Portree.
Here in the Glendale area, as commemorated by this monument, the crofters began a rent strike and began to graze some of their cattle on the common land again. The local sheriff, William Ivory, applied for and was granted permission to bring in the military to bring the rebellious crofters back into line.
Ivory, stung by his earlier defeat, arranged for a number of gunboats to moor here in the loch and led armed troops up the hills in search of the rebels.
The crofters, meanwhile, were gathering, some 600 of them, in this natural amphitheatre across the road here to have a meeting, and they were just finishing with a prayer when the soldiers arrived at the top of the hill. Some of the soldiers tried to provoke them, but in what amounts to an early example of non-violent resistance, one of their leaders had urged them not to respond as they had in the Braes with stones, but to hold firm with quiet dignity and disperse peaceably.
John Macpherson, that leader, along with a few others, had already endured 2 months in prison, for which they became known as the Glendale Martyrs. These events, including Ivory's aggression and the dignity of the tenants, were witnessed by the press, and soon public opinion began to swing behind the crofters' cause. It would take several more years of campaigning and a government commission to bring in the act that would meet some of the crofters' demands. Of course, neither the crofters nor the clans before them were picture postcard bucolic innocents.
The clans were forever fighting each other, conquering and being reconquered like small-scale empires. And indeed, in 1578, the townland of Trumpan here witnessed a notorious massacre when members of the clan MacDonald came ashore and set fire to this church, killing all but one of the worshippers inside. This was just one link in a chain of tit-for-tat retaliatory killings. Before that, the MacLeods had set a fire outside a cave in which some MacDonalds were sheltering, killing all of them. And that one person who survived the fire raised the alarm, and the MacLeods pursued the fleeing MacDonalds, caught up with them, killed them, and threw a dyke wall over them in a makeshift grave, giving rise to the name of the Battle of the Spoiling Dyke. So to say it again, we mustn't romanticise the ways of the clans. But what if we were to try to learn something from their way of relating to each other and to the land? What if we were to try to develop those bonds of belonging beyond the confines of the clan?
Perhaps today, facing into the global challenges of the 21st century, something of the spirit of Dúchas, not to say the spirit of the Spirit Cellarman, might help us develop a more democratic, capacious, grounded sense of belonging together and to the land, beyond the cold exchanges of the abstract, extractive market. An earthy sense that, in the end, we're all commoners, and on the one common. And what of Neil Lamont, the Spirit Cellarman himself?
Well, we know that in 1931, Mary, his wife, died in Belfast and was buried in Dundonald Cemetery. But for a while we couldn't find any further trace of Neil himself. So we looked back in the Scottish records, and sure enough, there he was. In the 1940 registry of deaths in the parish of Waternish, Neil Lamont is given as having died just before the new year in December of 1939 in this area of Lusta. As a widower, as an old man, he was 88 when he died, he had made his way back from Northern Ireland to see out his last days here on Skye. The Spirit Cellarman had come home.